Ohio, June is typically the gloomiest and wettest month of the year. But on one particular morning in June of 2001, when Akron resident Jeff Zach poked his head out of his bedroom window, he was thrilled to discover that the sun was out and the sky was clear. Jeff immediately rushed to his closet to change into his yard work clothes. He pulled on a t-shirt, and then he zipped up a pair of beat-up old cargo shorts, and then he raced down the stairs, grabbed his pruning shears, and then dashed out the back door without even putting his shoes on. On the stoop behind his house, the 44-year-old gardening enthusiast / professional landscaper paused briefly to admire his work. Although Jeff's backyard was a pretty standard size and shape for an American house in the suburbs, it was filled with lush green grass that was always perfectly cut, and around the perimeter of the yard, Jeff had planted the colorful rose bushes that were just about to reach their peak bloom. After stepping down the few back steps, Jeff began marching across his beautiful grass toward his rose bushes to do some pruning. As he walked along, he smiled to himself, feeling certain he must have the best landscaping in the whole neighborhood. Jeff was a very competitive guy, and so he loved being the best at things. But as much as he'd love to say that he had some kind of magical touch with plants, the truth was, Jeff just understood how plants worked. Give them the right mixture of sunlight, soil, and water, and plants will reward you with fruit and flowers. Simple. But as Jeff lifted his pruning shears to make the first cut, he heard his wife Bonnie calling to him from the kitchen about breakfast being ready, and he was instantly reminded that people were not like plants. People were complicated. You could give them everything they ever thought they wanted, and still they'd be miserable. And as Jeff cut back the errant stems of his rose bush, he thought about how his relationship with Bonnie was a perfect example of this. Jeff and Bonnie had gotten married 15 years ago. At the time, they wanted the same things in life, stability and family, and they were both very physically attracted to each other. So, logically speaking, their marriage should have worked out perfectly. But it didn't, at least not to Jeff. Even though Bonnie had given Jeff the family and the stability he'd always wanted, and she still was very attractive to him, there were still times when Jeff just could not stand to look at her. And sometimes just the sound of her voice, even when she was doing something nice, like that morning calling out to him to let him know that she had made him breakfast, was like nails on a chalkboard for Jeff. And not because Bonnie was a bad person or bad wife. Really, it was the opposite. She was a great wife who'd given him everything he thought he wanted, but still Jeff just felt unhappy. And unfortunately, his unhappiness had led to bitter resentment of his wife. However, recently, Jeff had begun telling himself that it was him who needed to make changes, not his wife. And so, over the last month, Jeff had been making a very conscious effort to be kinder, more patient, and less hot-headed when he was around his wife and also his son. But every day was a struggle. After cutting one more stem on his rose bush, Jeff stood up and walked back over to the door leading into the house. He paused just outside of it and took a few deep breaths to calm down. He knew he felt annoyed with his wife, for really no other reason than he heard her voice. But he told himself today he would do his best to be a better husband and a better father. Jeff wiped his feet on the mat, and then he opened the door and stepped inside. Less than an hour later, Jeff had fallen back into his old angry ways and was screaming at his wife Bonnie for no apparent reason and saying he wanted a divorce. Moments later, Jeff was storming outside, slamming the front door behind him. Once outside, Jeff clambered into his Ford Explorer SUV parked in the driveway, and after firing the engine up, he flew out of the driveway and just started driving. For the next couple of hours, Jeff drove around the city aimlessly, honking and yelling at other drivers, and just kind of generally taking out his anger on anyone who happened to come near him. But at a certain point during this kind of crazed drive around town, Jeff realized he actually had a lot of errands he needed to run, so he decided he would start doing those. Jeff usually had a lot of errands to run because he worked in a lot of different businesses. In addition to professionally landscaping, Jeff also worked as a handyman, he did some flooring work, and he also owned and operated a slew of vending machines around town. As Jeff was getting ready to head to a hardware store for his first errand, he looked down and he realized he was very low on gas. So instead of going to the hardware store, Jeff decided he would go to BJ's. BJ's is a big American wholesale store, and it's where Jeff went every Saturday to buy items for his various vending machines. BJ's also had their own gas station right out front near the parking lot, so Jeff figured he could get the gas he needed for his car and then also knock out a vending machine refill run. When Jeff arrived out front of BJ's and looked at the parking lot and the gas station, he was immediately struck by how crowded the place seemed. Now, BJ's is a very popular store, and the parking lot is usually full of people, but this day it just seemed like there were way more people than usual. But when Jeff looked at his watch and saw the date, he knew why. It was Saturday, June 16th, the day before Father's Day, and so most likely, all these people were here getting all the things they would need for their celebration the next day. Things like hot dogs and hamburgers, chips, soda, lawn chairs, charcoal for grills. Father's Day is a big cookout day in the US. And as Jeff thought about Father's Day, his heart sunk. What a terrible father and husband he had been that morning, yelling at his wife and slamming the door on the way out. Suddenly, all Jeff wanted to do was rush home, say he was sorry, and give his wife and son a big hug. So he whipped his Ford Explorer into the gas station right up alongside an open pump, and as quick as he could, he got to work getting the nozzle into his car to start filling up. There were so many vehicles moving in and out of the gas station that Jeff didn't even notice the motorcyclist in the full-faced helmet pull up right behind him. After filling his car's tank and then putting the pump back in the holster, Jeff climbed back inside of his car. And there, sitting behind the wheel, Jeff glanced over at all the happy families buzzing around the BJ's parking lot, loading their Father's Day celebration goods into their cars, and as he watched, Jeff felt another pang of regret about how he had acted that morning. Luckily, he'd be home soon, he could apologize, and maybe even salvage a fun Father's Day the next day. But before Jeff could fire up his car's engine, the motorcyclist in the full-faced helmet that had pulled up behind Jeff walked up to Jeff's driver's side window. Jeff noticed him and looked up at him through his window very inquisitively, and as he did this, the motorcyclist casually raised a .38 caliber handgun from his waist. He aimed it at the glass and fired a single shot directly into Jeff's face. Jeff's head fell forward onto the car's horn, and suddenly, between the sound of the gunshot and the sound of Jeff's car horn, which was now just blaring constantly, everyone at the gas station and in the nearby BJ's parking lot was thrown into a sudden panic. That is, everyone except for the motorcyclist who had just shot Jeff. While everyone else was screaming and running around and trying to figure out what was going on, the motorcyclist simply turned around, walked calmly back to their bike, and then rode away from the scene as if nothing happened. One of the people who actually saw the shooting take place was the gas station attendant, and within 30 seconds of the shooting, this attendant was on the phone with 911. But by that point, it was already too late for Jeff. He was dead. Jeff had been murdered in front of dozens of people in one of the most crowded shopping centers in the city, and yet, when police arrived just a few minutes after the 911 call, they would discover that not a single witness could actually identify the shooter. In fact, nobody could even say for sure if the shooter was a man or a woman. All that anyone could remember was that the motorcyclist had been wearing a full-faced helmet and that they were riding a green and white Ninja motorcycle. Given the cold-blooded nature of the murder and the fact that it was done in broad daylight in public, the police knew it was only a matter of time before the news of what happened found its way to the victim's family, Jeff's family. To ensure that that was not how the family learned about Jeff's death, not long after arriving on scene and identifying Jeff, police officers radioed back to the station to tell the chief that someone needed to go to Jeff's house ASAP to break the news. 15 minutes later, a pair of detectives arrived in front of Jeff's perfectly landscaped two-story home. And when Jeff's wife, Bonnie, opened the door, the police were apologetic but direct. They told the 46-year-old woman what happened to her husband and asked if she knew of anyone who might want to hurt him. Bonnie leaned against the doorframe as if it was the only thing holding her up. It was clear that Bonnie was shocked by the news of her husband's death, but as Bonnie would tell the detectives, she was not exactly surprised by it. For one thing, Bonnie said, Jeff had a lot of enemies. In fact, Jeff seemed to make enemies wherever he went. He was an aggressive and deeply unhappy person who seemed to enjoy being confrontational. So, as far as Bonnie was concerned, it was definitely possible that Jeff had been killed by someone he had upset. But Bonnie was quick to tell police that she did not think her husband had been killed by a total stranger. Before saying another word, Bonnie scanned the street out front and then invited the detectives to come inside her house where she could explain why she thought this was no random attack. The detectives followed Bonnie into her kitchen, and once they were all seated around the table, Bonnie told them that she believed her husband knew he was going to be killed. She said about a month earlier, Jeff had started acting different. Bonnie admitted that for years, Jeff had been emotionally and physically abusive with her. He also cheated on her constantly, and sometimes, as recently as that morning, he threatened to divorce her. But lately, Bonnie told them, he'd been generally kinder to her, all things considered, which was very noticeable, and he had also begun saying strange things to her that seemed to indicate that he thought he was going to die soon. Bonnie said that 3 weeks earlier, Jeff had taken her down into their basement to show her where he kept his financial papers. Bonnie asked him why he was showing this to her now, all of a sudden, after 15 years of marriage, and Jeff just said it was because he wanted her to know where to find things in case he wasn't around to provide for them. Bonnie thought this was totally ridiculous because her husband seemed totally healthy, and so she didn't think much of it. However, Bonnie told the detectives that just a few days ago, someone had called their house and left a voicemail for Jeff. It was a man who just kept demanding to speak with Jeff, and his tone very obviously suggested he was not happy with Jeff. Bonnie had saved the voicemail and wound up playing it right there in the kitchen for the detectives. And after the short message was over, they agreed that whoever was calling sounded very threatening. Bonnie told detectives that when Jeff came home on the night that this voicemail came through, she immediately played it for Jeff and then asked him who was that. Bonnie would tell detectives that as Jeff listened to this recording, he looked visibly frightened by whoever was on the phone. But he would say to Bonnie that he didn't know who it was or what they wanted, and that Bonnie should just forget about it and move on. But Bonnie could tell her husband was lying. It seemed obvious to her that Jeff knew who this guy was, he knew what he wanted, and he just didn't want to tell her. This information was obviously very interesting to the detectives, but the most interesting thing they would hear while visiting Jeff's house was not this recording or anything Bonnie said. Instead, it was something Jeff and Bonnie's 12-year-old son said. While Bonnie and the detectives sat at the kitchen table talking, Bonnie and Jeff's son came into the house, and after he was told what happened to his father, he was absolutely devastated, but after composing himself, he told police that he might know who killed his father. He said just one night earlier, he had been watching TV with his dad when out of the blue, his dad, Jeff, turned to him and said, "If anything happens to me, Ed George did it." At the mention of this name, Ed George, the detectives' ears perked straight up because they knew who Ed George was. In fact, pretty much anyone who lived in Akron, Ohio knew who Ed George was. Ed was one of the wealthiest men in Akron, and he owned one of the city's most popular institutions, a place called Tangier. Tangier was part restaurant, part nightclub, and part banquet hall. And over the years, it had played host to major celebrities and personalities, ranging from the Beach Boys to Tina Turner to President George H.W. Bush, and years later, his son, President George W. Bush. There had always been rumors that some of Ed's wealth might be tied to organized crime, but those rumors had never been substantiated. And as far as anyone could tell, Ed was an upstanding citizen. He was an active member of the Catholic Church and a devoted father of 7 kids. So why had Jeff told his son that Ed might hurt him someday? After talking for a while with the son and with Bonnie, the detectives left for the night. The next morning, when the detectives went into the station, they told their colleagues about what Jeff had told his son about Ed George. And in that moment, one of the detectives, a guy named Paul Callahan, suddenly remembered a strange interaction he'd had with Ed about 6 months back. Paul had known Ed for years. Paul was in an Irish folk band that used to play at Ed's restaurant, Tangier, every St. Patrick's Day, So it wasn't weird for Paul to get a social call from Ed every once in a while. But 6 months ago, when Ed called Paul on his office line at the police station, it was not for a social call. On this call, Ed told Paul that some guy had been harassing his wife, Cindy. Paul asked Ed if he knew who this guy was, and Ed said yes. Paul said, "Okay, who is it?" But Ed said he didn't want to tell Paul. He also said he didn't want to file a police report. At first, Paul was confused by this, but he sensed that maybe Ed was just looking for some advice on how to handle the situation on his own. So Paul told Ed to just go confront the guy and tell him to leave Cindy alone. Ed said, "Okay, thank you," and then they both hung up. Now, normally, Paul might have just forgotten about a call like this. Except, this was not the only time Ed called Paul about this guy who was harassing his wife. In fact, just 2 weeks earlier, so roughly 5 months after this first call Paul got from Ed, and only 2 weeks before Jeff's murder, Ed called Paul again to say this guy was still harassing Cindy. After Paul finished telling his colleagues about these strange calls he got from Ed, the whole police department quickly began to wonder if maybe the guy who was harassing Ed's wife was actually Jeff, and maybe Ed did confront Jeff about it, and in the process of this confrontation, Ed killed Jeff. Regardless, the police knew they needed to figure out why Jeff had told his son that he thought Ed was going to hurt him. And who better to ask than Ed himself? So the next day, a team of 4 detectives drove out to Ed George's house, located 20 miles outside of Akron. The house was actually more like a compound. It sat on 18 acres of land and was made up of 2 big buildings. There was the main house, which was a whopping 8,000 square feet, and then there was the second house, which was a separate 4-bedroom home just for Ed and Cindy's servants. The detectives had all heard about how big Ed's property was, but when they turned off the main road and began driving up Ed's long driveway, they were all stunned by the sheer size of everything. The detectives reached the end of the driveway and parked right near the front steps of the main house. Then they climbed out of their vehicle and walked up to the front door and they knocked. A moment later, they heard shuffling feet coming from inside the house. Then the door slowly opened and the detectives were met with one of the George family's nannies. After the nanny said a quick hello, she asked the detectives what they were doing there. And when they explained the situation, the nanny said that Ed was actually not home at the moment. He was out golfing and wouldn't be back for a while. But she said Ed's wife, Cindy, was home if they wanted to talk to her. The detectives tried to act casual. They said, "Okay, yeah, sure, we'll talk to Cindy." But secretly, the detectives were actually thrilled about the prospect of talking to Ed's wife without Ed around to supervise. The detectives knew Cindy from Tangier. She often acted as the hostess. She was warm and charismatic, and she was also extremely beautiful. In fact, just 1 year earlier, Cindy had placed 3rd in the Mrs. Ohio America pageant. But when 47-year-old Cindy emerged from her wing of the house, she looked extremely frail and broken down. The mother of 7 smiled a weak smile and then invited the detectives to join her in one of the family's large sitting rooms. Once they were all settled in, detectives explained that they were there to ask some questions about the death of Jeff Zach. Cindy was nervous, but she told them she would do her best to answer all of their questions. When asked what her husband, Ed, had been doing on the morning that Jeff was murdered, she said he had spent the entire morning at Tangier dealing with a drainage issue. As for her own whereabouts that morning, Cindy said that she was at home with her 7 kids getting everybody ready to go to a friend's wedding that was being held later that afternoon. When the detectives eventually shifted the conversation and asked Cindy directly if Jeff had been the person who was harassing her, Cindy seemed taken aback that they knew about that, but after taking a breath, she looked down and said, "Yes, he was." Cindy said that Jeff had actually been a friend of the family for many years, but at some point earlier that year, he just started calling the house incessantly, asking to talk to Cindy. When asked, Cindy said she did not know why Jeff was calling so much or what he wanted to talk to her about, But she didn't say it confidently, and as she said this, she looked kind of troubled. To the detectives, it seemed like Cindy might be hiding something about Jeff, but she also seemed totally scared about it. So the detectives very gently followed up with another similar question to try to figure out what Cindy knew. They said, well, even if you don't know why he was calling you, could you maybe just take a guess as to what he wanted? Cindy looked down at her hands as if the answer to this question was written somewhere on them, and then, after a long pause, she looked back up at the detectives and shook her head before telling them again she just didn't know. The detectives felt confident that Cindy did know more about Jeff than she was letting on, but they got the feeling that she was not going to open up much more that day. So they very politely wrapped up the conversation, thanked Cindy for her time, and then they made their way back outside to their car and headed back to the station. The next morning, Paul called his old friend Ed and asked him if he wouldn't mind coming into the station so they could ask him some questions about Jeff Zach's murder. Ed responded by saying, of course, me and Cindy will be there soon. But neither Ed nor Cindy would come down to the police station that day. Instead, about an hour after that phone call with Paul, Ed's lawyer showed up at the police station and walked straight up to Paul's desk and informed the detective that his client, Ed George, would not be participating in this investigation. The lawyer then turned around and left. Paul was stunned. He felt like if Ed was innocent, he never would have sent his lawyer in like that. But without evidence tying Ed to Jeff's murder, there was really nothing the police could do. Over the next few weeks, the police tried calling Ed and Cindy's friends and relatives in the hopes that someone would be willing to shed some light on what happened between Ed and Cindy and Jeff. But one after another, Ed's friends and family all declined to speak with law enforcement and just told the detectives to speak with their lawyers instead. And these lawyers, the detectives would discover, were all being paid for by Ed. But again, despite how guilty Ed looked, without evidence, there was really nothing police could do about Ed or how he was conducting himself. So the detectives had to go back to the drawing board. They spent days reviewing the crime scene photos and reading witness statements and playing Bonnie's voicemail tape over and over again, but none of that got them anywhere. And then, one day, the detectives realized they'd missed something. The detectives were sitting around at a conference table talking in circles about the case when one of the detectives picked up a photo of the George family, and this detective immediately noticed something. In this photo were Ed and Cindy and their 7 kids. 2 of their kids were adopted, and so of course they looked nothing like Ed or Cindy. But as this detective stared at this photo, they noticed that 4 of the 5 biological children looked exactly like Ed and Cindy. But the 5th biological child, the youngest, the 8-year-old, looked nothing like Ed or Cindy. Instead, this youngest child looked just like the murder victim, Jeff Zach. The detective who noticed this turned the photo around to show her colleagues, and after looking it over, they all agreed. And if this 8-year-old child was indeed Jeff's child, not Ed's, then the child was clear evidence of an affair happening between Cindy and Jeff, which would give Jeff a reason for wanting to call Cindy all the time, and it would give Ed a motive for wanting to kill Jeff. When the detectives brought this theory to the county prosecutor's office, they agreed. There was enough evidence to get a warrant that would force the Georges to take a paternity test. So that's what they did. The warrant was issued, and on August 24th, 2001, a little more than 2 months after Jeff's murder, Ed and Cindy, along with the 8-year-old youngest child, arrived in a doctor's office to take a court-ordered DNA test. And sure enough, when the results came back 3 weeks later, it would show that Jeff was the father of this child, not Ed. The George family was notified by phone, so the detectives didn't get to see how Ed or Cindy reacted to the news. But when the results of this paternity test made it to the local press, people were absolutely shocked. Ed and Cindy were like local celebrities, and they seemed like the perfect couple. So this news about Cindy's affair quickly swept through the city, and soon locals would begin openly speculating about the possibility that Ed had hired a hitman to murder his wife's lover, Jeff. And it wasn't just the locals who thought this was what happened. The police also suspected that this was a professional hit. And so they began scouring Ed's phone records, his bank statements, and questioned every Tangier employee willing to speak to them in order to find the evidence they needed that proved Jeff's murder was an assassination paid for by Ed. But after months of looking, they found nothing, and so it was starting to look like this case was going to go cold. However, about 1 year after the murder, a new tip would come into the station that would lead the detectives in a roundabout way to the home of a 40-year-old single mother named Christine Todero, and she would break the case wide open. Christine seemed to have no apparent connection to the case, but she believed that her ex-husband was the masked motorcycle-riding hitman, the man who killed Jeff Zack. And the reason she believed this was because one time, when she was speaking on the phone with her ex, he made this joke about him being the killer. But Christine suspected he was not actually joking, because during her brief marriage to him, 35-year-old John Zaffino had been violent and dangerous. In fact, Christine left him because he punched her 13-year-old son in the face and, in a separate incident, broke Christine's arm intentionally. When Christine listened to the mysterious voicemail that Jeff's wife Bonnie had shown police, where some guy was demanding to speak to Jeff, Christine's eyes shot wide open and she said, "Yes, 100%, that is my ex-husband, John." After that, detectives would run a search on any and all vehicles registered in John's name, and by noon, they had a full report in their hands. Everybody at the station got a copy of this report, and together, the detectives reviewed it line by line, scanning for anything that could tie John to Jeff's murder. And within minutes, the detectives found what they were looking for. According to the report, in May of 2001, less than 1 month before Jeff's murder, John had purchased a motorcycle from a dealership outside of Akron. And when police called that dealership, the manager told them that the bike John had purchased was a black ninja-style bike with a green stripe, just like the one ridden by the person who killed Jeff. Detectives would also discover that in that same month, John had also purchased a weapon, a .38 caliber handgun, the same kind of gun that killed Jeff. But while John certainly looked like the prime murder suspect, there were still 2 questions the detectives were struggling to answer. The first was, why would John do this? There was no connection between him and Jeff whatsoever. So was he just a hitman, potentially hired by Ed? Nobody knew. The second question was, how could John afford the very expensive motorcycle and gun? The police had done a lot of digging on John, and they knew he did not have very much money. In fact, John was so deep in debt, he couldn't even afford his own apartment. The police would spend months searching for the answers to these 2 general questions, and by the time John was arrested in September of 2002, detectives would be convinced that both of these questions actually had the same answer, and that answer was Sparky. Sparky was the nickname John had given to a woman he met one night in the summer of 2000, about a year before Jeff's murder. That summer, John was standing outside of a restaurant in Akron when he saw this woman, Sparky, walking toward her car. She was beautiful, she was alone, and to John, she looked really sad. So John walked up to her and started a conversation. And quickly, in this conversation, Sparky would tell John that she was married, to which he said he didn't care because he was married too, to Christine. John reached into his pocket and pulled out an old gum wrapper and then wrote his phone number on it, and then he handed the paper to Sparky and asked her to please call him that night after she got home so he would know she arrived safely. Sparky would indeed call John later that night when she got home, and they would chat for a while, nothing more. But not long after this first interaction, Sparky began sneaking off from her husband to go meet up with John. Now, at the time, John did not have a steady source of income or an apartment of his own. So, not long after they met, Sparky moved John into an apartment that she paid for where they could spend the nights alone together. She also paid all of John's other bills and bought him a cell phone so she could reach him whenever she wanted. It was an extremely passionate love affair, but they both talked openly about the future and how maybe there was some way for them to be together long term. However, Sparky made it very clear that no matter what, she would never, ever leave her husband. Before she married her husband, she had nothing. She was a poor coal miner's daughter living in a 200-square-foot house with 3 other people. But now, through her husband, she had a home and she had some nice things, and so she was not prepared to give any of that up. However, things in Sparky's married life were far from perfect, as John would find out one night in January of 2001, roughly 6 months after meeting Sparky. That January night, Sparky called John hysterically crying. She told him that an ex-boyfriend of hers was giving her serious problems. It would turn out John was not the first man Sparky had had an affair with. It would also turn out that this other guy was not technically Sparky's ex-boyfriend, at least not yet. Sparky had been seeing this other guy for nearly a decade, and she had tried to break it off with him many times in the past, but each time, he always figured out a way to rope her back in. But now that Sparky was with John, she finally had the courage to tell this other guy that it was really over. And so she had told him that she did not want to see him again or have any contact with him whatsoever. And this made the now ex-boyfriend absolutely furious. He started threatening to hurt Sparky and her children, and he threatened to expose their secret relationship to the public. Sparky was terrified and didn't know what to do. John's reaction to all of this was not being upset with Sparky for seeing another man. Instead, John's reaction was fear. He was scared that if this ex-boyfriend exposed Sparky, then Sparky's husband would divorce her, and suddenly Sparky wouldn't have all that money that she got from her husband, and so Sparky would not be able to pay for John's life. Because remember, Sparky is paying for John's apartment, she's paying all his bills, she's paying for everything. And so John couldn't have that happen. He needed to make sure Sparky and her husband stayed married for his sake. And so naturally, a plan was made to murder Sparky's very troublesome ex-boyfriend, whose real name was Jeff Zack. No one knows for sure if Sparky or John initiated this murder plan, but what investigators do know is that in May of 2001, about 1 month before Jeff Zack was murdered, Sparky withdrew $5,300 from her bank account. And then 3 hours later, John used that same amount of money to buy the black Ninja-style bike with the green stripe. Also that same month, John purchased a handgun from one of his colleagues at the trucking company where he worked. A couple weeks after that, John quit his job at the trucking company because, as John told one of his colleagues, his girlfriend was going to be, quote, setting him up in business. 1 week later, on Saturday, June 17th, 2001, the day before Father's Day, John suited up in full-body leather and put on a full-faced motorcycle helmet over his head. Then he rode his brand-new motorcycle to BJ's Wholesale to wait for Jeff. John knew that Jeff would most likely swing by BJ's at some point that day because usually on Saturdays, Jeff would go to BJ's to buy candy to restock his vending machines. And so at 11:49 a.m., Sparky, aka Cindy George, mother of 7, called her lover and hitman, John, on the cell phone she had bought for him. The pair talked on the phone while John rode in circles on his motorcycle around the BJ's parking lot, hoping, praying that Jeff would show up. That call would end at 11:56, just as John spotted Jeff pulling into the parking lot in his Ford Explorer. As Jeff pulled up to one of the gas pumps, John pulled up right behind him. Then, after Jeff had fueled his vehicle and gotten back inside, John got off his motorcycle, pulled the handgun out of his saddlebag, and then walked right up to Jeff's driver's side window, aimed his gun, and fired a single shot directly into Jeff's face. In the confusion that followed, John managed to hop back on his motorcycle and ride quickly away from the scene without being followed. About 20 minutes later, when he'd reached a safe distance from the crime scene, he called Cindy again. We don't know exactly what was said on that call, but it's assumed that on this call, John told Cindy that he had just killed Jeff and that she no longer had to worry about her marriage to Ed falling apart. But, of course, whatever peace that murder brought for Cindy and John was short-lived. Because in June of 2003, almost exactly 2 years after Jeff was murdered, John was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Cindy would be arrested a year and a half after John went to jail, and then 11 months after her arrest, Cindy would be convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to life in prison as well. However, Cindy's conviction would not stand. Less than 2 years after being sentenced, her conviction was overturned on appeal. The justices ruled that the evidence presented in her trial was insufficient to prove her guilt. And so, on March 22, 2007, almost 6 years after the murder of Jeff Zach, Cindy George was released from prison. And waiting for her outside the prison walls were her 7 kids and her husband, Ed. After a long, tearful embrace, the family hopped into a car and took Cindy back to their giant estate outside of Akron, where she and her family still live today.
On Sunday, January 13th, 2008, Rhonda Smith sat in the back pew of the historic Trinity Lutheran Church in tiny Springfield Township, Pennsylvania, doing her best to try to stay calm. The 42-year-old choir singer knew that her pastor, Greg Shreves, would soon call her up to the pulpit to speak, so she was keeping a close eye on him, waiting for his signal. The winter sun streamed in through the stained glass windows of the 18th century sanctuary, and the rays caught the minister's beautiful pale blue eyes. And when this happened, Rhonda noticed, and right away she couldn't help but think to herself how unbelievably handsome the minister really was. At age 56, Shreves was an unlikely minister. He had spent decades as a country club golf pro and official on the professional golf tour before answering God's call in 2005. Shreves was more than 6 feet tall and very fit, and he had blonde hair that was still visible amongst his grays. And he was single. Now, Rhonda was not romantically involved with her minister. To her mind, it was just more of an intimate friendship. But she was deeply touched by everything the minister had done for her. On this particular Sunday, as Rhonda sat nervously in the pew, Pastor Shreves announced that a fundraising campaign he had launched to help Rhonda with her expenses had brought in $3,000. Then Pastor Shreves gave the signal to Rhonda for her to come up and say a few words. And so when Rhonda stood up and began walking towards the pulpit, the 100 or so people in the pews immediately began to applaud and cheer as she walked towards the front. By the time Rhonda was standing at the pulpit next to Pastor Shreves, she was totally embarrassed, but also very touched. Rhonda had actually asked Pastor Shreves for this opportunity to thank the whole congregation, but now that she was actually up there, she was shaking with anxiety. She looked over at Pastor Shreves, who nodded warmly to her, as if to say, "You can do this." So Rhonda took a deep breath, and then she began to speak. She would tell the members of the church that in the 2 years since she had been attending Trinity Lutheran, she had felt welcomed with open arms. This really felt like her home. Rhonda's voice broke as she admitted to the struggles in her life, struggles that many in the congregation already knew about. Rhonda was unable to work full-time because of her battles with mental illness, which had driven her at times to thoughts of suicide. She had been in danger of being evicted from her apartment because she couldn't afford her bills when Pastor Shreves stepped in and began raising money for her. Rhonda tearfully said she owed a debt of gratitude to everyone in the sanctuary as she looked out at all the beaming faces. Out in the crowd was Judy Zellner, a 60-year-old grandmother who was Rhonda's best friend at church. Judy had actually introduced herself to Rhonda on the very first day that Rhonda had shown up at Trinity. And in no time, they were having lunches together like old pals. There was also Mary Jane Fonder, who was also out in the pews, and she was a singer in the choir with Rhonda. Mary Jane was 65 years old and very eccentric. She often wore a wig, sometimes backwards, but she was so kind. One time, when Rhonda was not feeling very well, Mary Jane had baked her a blueberry pie as a way to cheer her up. And of course, there was Pastor Shreves standing right next to Rhonda, who had taken Rhonda under his wing and even offered her temporary work in the church office. Rhonda had never met a man that was so caring and loving. To close out her speech, Rhonda, again very tearfully, told the congregation how thankful she was, and she also said, I don't know what would have happened to me without all of your love and support, so thank you. and then after that, the room broke into applause again. As Rhonda stepped down from the pulpit, Pastor Shreves made a show of smiling really wide and winking right at Rhonda, really letting her know how special she was. And as she walked back to her pew, feeling very special, she couldn't help but wonder if any of the other women in the congregation felt just a little jealous because of her obvious close relationship to Pastor Shreves, someone that all the women really seemed to like in this church. But just then, Rhonda noticed someone unfamiliar sitting in her row. The man had a gray beard, messy hair, and he wore glasses. His clothes looked rumpled, and Rhonda noticed that he was actually the only person in the entire church who was not clapping for her. The following Sunday, Rhonda did not go to church. Instead, she was sobbing uncontrollably on the phone with a mental health counselor, saying that she was a failure and couldn't drag herself out of bed. Social workers were so worried about her that they visited Rhonda's apartment just to make sure she didn't hurt herself. When they got there, they found Rhonda in her pajamas, looking like she hadn't slept for days. The social workers really wanted her to sign up for an inpatient treatment program, but Rhonda said absolutely not. She was supposed to start work as a temporary secretary for the church on Monday, and she was not about to miss that, even if it meant giving up going into this treatment program. She had made a promise to Pastor Shreves that she would do this job, and she was not about to let him down. Rhonda knew that she was repeating a familiar pattern. Just when something good was right within reach, she would have a mental breakdown that kind of ruined it. She had always dreamed of being a teacher, but these bouts of depression and anorexia had kind of doomed her ambitions. Now she was unemployed in her 40s, and her romantic life was not much better. Rhonda was a smart and attractive person, but her relationships always fell apart. At one point, she had poured her heart out to Pastor Shreves about her history of bad boyfriends. And when she did, he put his arm around her and he reminded her that it only takes one good person. Pastor Shreves called that Sunday night to check in on Rhonda after she didn't come to church. He wanted to make sure Rhonda was okay, but he also wanted to make sure that she'd be able to work the next day. The pastor was going to be away at a conference, and so he needed someone there at the church to answer the phones. And Rhonda promised him she would be there bright and early. By Wednesday morning, so 3 days into her temporary job, Rhonda had learned the routine of her new job, but it was making her lonely. From 9 to 5 every day, Rhonda was supposed to sit in this little plain office inside of the church and just wait for the phone to ring. With Pastor Shreves gone, she was the only person in the church, so she had no one to talk to while she worked and way too much time to think about her own problems. But on this Wednesday, she did her best to cheer herself up by reminding herself that she had a date that day after work. He was a nice man that she'd met in a bipolar disorder support group, so maybe he would understand the ups and downs of her life. But right now, the end of the day when that date was going to start seemed really far off to Rhonda. Rhonda wished someone, anyone, would call just to break up the monotony of the day. Even if that call came from the very eccentric, backwards wig-wearing Mary Jane Fonder, who often called the church and seemed totally confused. In fact, Mary Jane had called the church on Rhonda's first day of work on Monday, and when Mary Jane realized that Rhonda was filling in for the receptionist, Mary Jane promptly wished Rhonda a belated happy birthday. It was not Rhonda's birthday, but she said that she appreciated Mary Jane's thoughtfulness. But then Mary Jane began asking Rhonda, well, why didn't you invite me to your birthday party? Rhonda had said there was no party, but Mary Jane just did not believe her. Rhonda had finally made an excuse to get off the phone. But now, 2 days later, sitting in this room feeling so bored, left with these horrible thoughts in her head, Rhonda kind of wished Mary Jane would call. At least it was something to do. Rhonda had talked to mental health counselors 4 times in the past week as she felt herself slipping into the blackness of depression. Her parents were really worried about her. Her dad called her every morning just to hear Rhonda reassure him that she was up and at him. Rhonda wished that she really felt that way. At 10:55 a.m. that day, the metallic clunk of the church's side door opening broke the silence. Rhonda thought it might be Pastor Shreves, back from his conference earlier than expected, and for a moment, she was really excited. Rhonda swiveled around her chair, getting ready to greet the minister, but to her surprise, it was not Pastor Shreves. It was somebody else, and she couldn't really understand why they were there. But what surprised Rhonda even more was what this person was carrying in their hand. 2 hours later, at 1 p.m., Judy Zellner, who was Rhonda's best friend at church, parked outside of Trinity Church and stepped out of her van into the crisp winter air. Judy had long ago lost her tolerance for cold days like this, and so she made a beeline for the church building. Judy fumbled for her keys, eager to get inside of the warm building. She glanced into the ground floor window of the church offices, but didn't see anybody inside. Judy was the sexton of this church, which, she would joke, was a fancy way of saying she was the cleaning lady. And on this day, that was why she was at the church, to clean it. When Judy finally found the right key and put it inside the lock, she was surprised to find the side door of the church was actually already unlocked. Springfield Township was a community of only 5,000 people with very little crime, but the policy was, on weekdays, the church doors were supposed to be locked. But regardless, Judy stepped through the door and began to peel off her coat, and as she did, she looked up and noticed the door that led into the office where Rhonda was working was open. Judy walked over and stuck her head in the door and called out hello, but nobody called back. So Judy opened the door the rest of the way and she looked into the office, but there was no one sitting behind the desk, there was nobody inside the office, and she was about to leave and go walk around the church to find where this mystery person was who had unlocked the side door, when Judy spotted something just on the side of the desk inside of this office. It was somebody's foot. Judy at first didn't even know what to do, but then instinct took over and she rushed around the desk and she looked down and she could not believe what she was seeing. There was a woman laying face down in a pool of blood that had totally saturated the carpet beneath her. The woman's long brown hair was all matted red, and the side of her face that Judy could see was totally destroyed. It was like a shattered mess of flesh and bone. But whoever this woman was, she was still breathing. Judy could see her chest rising and falling. Judy wanted to roll this person over and try to perform CPR, but she could tell the woman's injuries were just too severe for her to help. Then it dawned on Judy, whoever hurt this person could still be inside the church. And so Judy snatched the church's cordless phone off its cradle and ran outside without her coat. Standing in the parking lot, freezing cold and shaking with fear, Judy dialed 911. When the dispatcher answered, Judy blurted out that somebody was attacked inside of her church. Paramedics and a state trooper arrived a few minutes later, and Judy showed them to the church office where she had found the woman on the ground. And when the paramedics went in there, the woman on the ground was still alive. And so the paramedics asked Judy to leave the office while they attended to this woman, and so Judy nodded and went back outside again, but then looped around to the side of the building and looked into the office through the window. And when she did, she saw the paramedics lift the woman off the ground and roll her over onto a backboard to take her out to the ambulance. And it was at this point that Judy finally got a look at this woman, and the woman who had been hurt was her dear friend, Rhonda. "17 miles away, Pennsylvania State Trooper Greg Stumpo was eating lunch at his favorite Italian restaurant when he got a call from dispatch. A woman had been apparently shot inside of the Trinity Lutheran Church, and she was barely clinging to life, and so could Stumpo report to the scene. Since Stumpo was the senior officer on his three-man detective team, Stumpo knew he would lead any investigation. Stumpo wolfed down the rest of his chicken parmesan and then hit the road for the church. Even though he had been a detective in rural Bucks County, Pennsylvania for almost a decade now, Stumpo really had never gotten to investigate many murders. Springfield Township itself had seen only 2 murders in the entire last 2 decades, and so Stumpo felt a big rush of adrenaline as he drove. By the time Stumpo arrived, the church was already crawling with police looking for physical evidence from the shooting. So Stumpo walked up to one of the other troopers and asked where he could find the woman who made the 911 call, Judy. The trooper immediately turned and pointed out to an idling van out in the parking lot. So Stumpo walked over and he knocked on Judy's window, which totally startled Judy. Judy had been sitting in her vehicle with the windows up, heat blasting, staring straight ahead, so shocked she couldn't even muster any tears. But she turned and looked over at Stumpo, and in his suit and tie, he did not look like a state trooper. And he very likely could tell that's what she was thinking, and so he reached down and picked up his badge and flashed it to her to show her who he was. At that point, Judy lowered down her window, but stayed in her van as she described for Stumpo what happened when she walked inside of the church. She would tell Stumpo that when she first walked into the office, the woman on the floor was so bloody and mangled that Judy didn't recognize that it was her good friend Rhonda. And Judy said at first she was positive this woman on the ground was dead, but then she realized her chest was rising and falling, and so she was still alive. Judy couldn't understand why anybody would want to hurt her friend Rhonda. Judy described Rhonda as being very sweet and shy, with kind eyes and a warm smile. She said the two of them had hit it off immediately when they first met, and they had become very close friends, despite the 20-year age difference between them. But Judy also told Stumpo that Rhonda had a dark side too. She struggled with bouts of depression that at times left her totally unable to function, and one time Rhonda had been so suicidal that she had to be hospitalized 5 years earlier. And Judy said, lately it seemed like Rhonda was slipping back into a depression. Stumpo was expressionless as he listened to Judy, but inside, based on what she was saying, he was beginning to wonder if maybe this was an attempted suicide rather than an attempted murder. But there was an immediate complication to that theory. Police had not recovered a weapon. If Rhonda shot herself, shouldn't the gun be right there at the scene? Maybe even still in her hand? After speaking with Judy, Stumpo went back inside the church and over to the church office where Rhonda had been found. And when he went in there, he noticed there was now a black tape outline of where Rhonda's body had been, and it was on this part of the rug that was now totally covered in blood. Stumpo got down on his hands and knees to see if maybe there was a gun under the desk or some of the other furniture nearby, but there was nothing. And then an idea occurred to Stumpo. Did someone help Rhonda shoot herself, perhaps disposing of the weapon for her afterwards? He went back outside to Judy's van and asked directly if she removed a gun from the office. Judy was totally offended at the very idea. She'd been careful not to disturb anything. But while Stumpo was inside, Judy said she had thought of someone that police might want to speak with. Judy said she recalled a very unkempt-looking stranger who had come to their church earlier in January when Rhonda had stood up before the congregation, and that was the first time that Judy had ever seen this guy. Judy said that on that day, as the donation plate was passed around, she overheard the stranger say something about how this church would be a good place to rob. Judy had not taken this comment seriously, but now she wondered, did this man shoot Rhonda while he was attempting to rob the church? Stumpo took down Judy's description of this man and figured it was possible that the stranger had come back to the church to rob it. Maybe Rhonda was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. As Stumpo headed to his car, he asked one of the troopers to make sure they spoke to the minister and see if he could figure out if anything valuable was missing from the church. After that, Stumpo drove to St. Luke's Hospital, where paramedics had taken Rhonda. Once he was there, he found Rhonda in a private room, heavily bandaged and unconscious. Her forlorn-looking parents stood vigil at her bedside. The doctor told Stumpo before he entered that Rhonda was being kept alive by machines, and it was very unlikely that she would survive after so much brain damage and loss of blood. Rhonda's parents, Jim and Dorothy Smith, who were both in their 70s, agreed to step outside to a waiting area with Stumpo where they could all chat. Stumpo brought them coffee in styrofoam cups, and he sat down and started by saying how very sorry he was about what had happened. Then Rhonda's father, Jim, told Stumpo about Rhonda's long struggle with bipolar disorder and the many times their daughter had flirted with suicide. Jim said he would never let Rhonda keep a gun around her apartment, and he would never keep one at his own house. Luckily, Jim added, the one time Rhonda had tried shooting a gun, she had hated it. And so Jim told Stumpo that he thought it was very unlikely that Rhonda would ever shoot herself. Jim told Stumpo that he and his wife Dorothy had not actually seen their daughter earlier that day. However, they had spoken to her around 8:30 a.m., and she sounded like she was in a good mood. Then again, Jim said, because of Rhonda's condition, her moods could sometimes change on a dime. 4 hours after that conversation, so at about 12:30 p.m., Jim and Dorothy had driven past the church on their way to lunch, and they saw Rhonda's car in the parking lot. The parents talked about stopping by and taking their daughter out for a bite, but they figured Rhonda was busy. Employment had been scarce for Rhonda, so they continued past the church and wound up eating lunch without her. The detective listened carefully and very sympathetically, but internally, he didn't get the feeling that these parents were going to actually offer up any information that could actually help investigators. But at the end of the conversation, Jim said something somewhat off the cuff to Stumpo that made Stumpo pause. Jim said that he prayed his daughter had not tried to kill herself. He and his wife were very religious, and they believed anybody who even attempted suicide faced eternal damnation, and so they couldn't bear such a fate for their beloved child. As the parents got up to leave, Jim told Stumpo that he really hoped investigators would not find a gun at the church. Jim's parting remark left Stumpo wondering whether they were telling the truth when they said they did not stop at the church on the way to lunch. Maybe, he thought, they walked into the church only to find their daughter lying on the floor from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The parents could have mistakenly believed their daughter was already dead, and maybe they took the weapon from the scene so it didn't look like a suicide. Stumpo knew this idea was a total long shot, but it was too early to rule out anything. Just as Stumpo was about to walk out the front door of the hospital, he spotted a tall, middle-aged man with a priest collar in the hospital lobby. The man dabbed at his eyes and composed himself before pressing the elevator button. Stumpo walked over to him and asked the man if he was Pastor Shreves from Trinity Lutheran. Shreves nodded and said he was on his way up to minister to Rhonda's family. Stumpo asked him if he wouldn't mind speaking to him for a couple of minutes, and Pastor Shreves agreed. Shreves was so anxious to get up to Rhonda's bedside that he could barely sit still while the two men talked. Shreves said, he blamed himself for what happened because he had not been at the church to protect Rhonda. The pastor admitted that he really didn't know what he was going to say to Rhonda's parents when he got up there, or what he was going to say to the congregation. Despite his age, Shreves had only just graduated from the seminary 3 years earlier. Before that, he was competing in golf tournaments, and so nothing in his limited experience as a minister had prepared him for something like this. The pastor also said he didn't know Rhonda all that well, and he couldn't remember when she actually first joined the congregation. He described her as a very quiet, lonely young woman who had struggled with mental health issues. Stumpo sized up the minister as he spoke. The man was very handsome, as Judy had mentioned to Stumpo, but what really stood out to Stumpo was not this guy's good looks, but the fact that he did not see Rhonda as a close friend. He actually said, he was not that close with her. Judy had told Stumpo that Rhonda saw the pastor as a very dear friend and mentor. And so to Stumpo, it seemed very clear that Rhonda and Pastor Shreves' relationship was very imbalanced. However, Pastor Shreves did know enough about Rhonda to suggest to Stumpo that he really should look into Rhonda's troubled love life. Shreves said that Rhonda had told him at one point that she had been in a very abusive relationship a few years ago, and things had actually gotten so bad that Rhonda sought the help of a domestic abuse center. Shreves said he didn't know who this ex-boyfriend was, but it was clear to him that their relationship still weighed on Rhonda years after they parted ways. Pastor Shreves told Stumpo that Rhonda also had a more recent breakup with a man she had met online who lived in Philadelphia. Shreves said that as far as he knew, Rhonda and this guy had gone on a few dates, but then at some point the guy had stopped returning Rhonda's calls, and that had left Rhonda feeling very sad and very wounded. Shortly after this, Stumpo and Shreves wrapped up their conversation, and Stumpo headed out the door. And as Stumpo left the hospital, his head was spinning. He had only been investigating the shooting of Rhonda Smith for a few hours, but he already had an array of theories. Did she shoot herself? Was she caught up in an armed robbery? Was she a victim of an abusive former boyfriend? He couldn't prove or disprove any of these. 2 hours later, around 6 p.m., Stumpo got a phone call from another detective, and they told him that Rhonda Smith was dead. Her parents had asked the doctors to take her off life support when it became clear she had absolutely no brain activity. And so the case now was no longer an attempted suicide or murder, it simply was a suicide or a murder. Rhonda was supposed to go on a date on the night that she died, and so Stumpo wasted no time figuring that out and then tracking the date down. The man's name was Gregory Danisavage, and Stumpo found him at his house just before 8 p.m., and he was still dressed in slacks and a blazer for his date that would never happen. Gregory said he was supposed to pick up Rhonda at her apartment at 6 p.m., but she didn't show, and she didn't send him a message to explain. and so he had sat outside in his car for a while and then finally just went home, hoping that nothing had happened to her. Unfortunately, Stumpo said, something had happened to her, but he wouldn't provide any details. Stumpo asked where Gregory had been late on Wednesday morning, and he had a ready answer. He said he was taking care of his mother as she recovered from surgery. Now seeming a bit nervous, Gregory told Stumpo that the last guy Rhonda had been dating might have wanted to harm her. And so he said, Rhonda feared that that guy was just using her for sex, and so she had tried to slow the relationship down. But when she did that, the guy basically stopped calling her, at which point Rhonda began calling him, but he never picked up. Stumpo thanked Gregory for the tip, and then he left. However, when Stumpo followed up on Gregory's tip about this previous guy who Rhonda had been seeing, who apparently was just using her for sex, well, Stumpo quickly determined that it was a total dead end. The guy's name was Ray Finkel, and he would tell Stumpo that he had only gone on 4 dates with Rhonda, and he had stopped calling her really just because her house was too far away. Finkel said he was working all day Wednesday, the day that Rhonda was killed, and he had the security card check-in to prove it. As Stumpo ended the call with Ray Finkel, he was thinking that neither Gregory nor Ray even knew Rhonda well enough to want her dead. These were not exactly torrid love affairs. However, the abusive ex-boyfriend that Pastor Shreves had warned about turned out to be a much darker story. A social worker at the domestic abuse center that Rhonda had called said that Rhonda had accused this man of sexually assaulting her 4 years ago and getting her pregnant. Rhonda eventually got an abortion, but the social worker said that Rhonda was haunted by the experience. Then the social worker said that as part of Rhonda's therapy, she kept a journal of her relationship with her abuser. And so the social worker told Stumpo that maybe that journal would give investigators the information that they needed. Rhonda's parents gave Stumpo the spare key to their daughter's apartment. And then when Stumpo went into the apartment, inside of a desk drawer, he found all these yellow legal pads that were filled with Rhonda's writing. And the writing included all the intimate details of her past relationship with this man who had hurt her so badly. They painted a picture of a very unhappy romance, one that continued even after she accused this man of abuse. But Rhonda indicated in her more recent entries that she had not had any contact with this guy for 2 whole years. And so this abusive boyfriend really seemed like a bad person, but he didn't really fit the profile of Rhonda's murderer because he had not interacted with her in years. And so Stumpo now understood why people said Rhonda was unlucky in love, but so far, nothing in her past seemed to add up to a motive for murder. While Stumpo tracked down the rest of Rhonda's boyfriends, other members of his team began to look into that strange newcomer to the church, the kind of disheveled-looking guy who Judy had overheard say, Trinity Lutheran would be a good place to rob. Well, despite having a great description of this guy within 24 hours of the shooting, he was about 5'10", he wore wire-rimmed glasses and had scraggly salt and pepper hair. Despite having this description, none of the state databases of criminals and people on parole or probation contained anyone who looked like this stranger. Now, of course, Stumpo didn't just rule him out as a potential suspect simply because he couldn't find him. However, at the same time, the whole robbery idea just seemed kind of unlikely to Stumpo. Pastor Shreves had told Stumpo that the church rarely had any cash inside, and the pastor actually looked all around the church and couldn't find anything missing following the shooting. So if Rhonda really was the victim of a robbery gone bad, then why wasn't anything stolen? And so 2 days into this investigation, and Stumpo had almost nothing to show for all his effort. He wasn't even sure if he was investigating a murder or a suicide. A few days later, on Monday afternoon, January 28th, so 5 days after the murder, Stumpo sat in the balcony of the church as Pastor Shreves led Rhonda's memorial service below. More than 250 people had packed into the church to show their love for Rhonda. Stumpo looked down and saw Rhonda's parents sitting in the front row, and as he did, he considered the possibility that, the parents had covered up their daughter's suicide. It seemed extremely unlikely, but it was still possible. Then Stumpo scanned around the rest of the teary-eyed parishioners and thought to himself, if Rhonda did not kill herself, then the culprit was probably in this room. After the service ended, Stumpo waited for the crowd to thin, then he asked Pastor Shreves if he had a few minutes. Shreves walked Stumpo out of the church and across the parking lot to the small ranch house where he lived. As they reached his porch, Stumpo noticed an apple pie sitting in front of the side door to the house, but Pastor Shreves was not happy about this pie. As soon as he read the note that was sitting on top of the pie, Shreves expressed his irritation. He explained to Stumpo that one of the members of the church would often leave food for him, even though he had asked her to stop. Stumpo asked Shreves who this woman was, and Shreves would say her name was Mary Jane. The same Mary Jane who was very eccentric and wore her wigs backwards, and at one point had actually baked a pie for Rhonda. Shreves would say, Mary Jane was a member of the church's choir and she was a talented artist whose paintings hung on the walls of the church, but he said, I think she has a crush on me. And as the pastor talked, Stumpo remembered how people at the church said there was like this running joke that, Pastor Shreves was single and handsome, and basically all the women who went to this church had crushes on him, and some of them liked to bring him unsolicited gifts like food. And so Stumpo was pretty sure that Rhonda Smith must be one of these admirers, just like Mary Jane was. And, that was probably why their relationship seemed so imbalanced, with Rhonda looking at the pastor as this mentor and close friend, and the pastor basically being like, yeah, I know Rhonda, she's nice, but that's about it. Over the next few days, the events on the morning of the shooting became increasingly clear as investigators talked to more people and collected records. On the day Rhonda died, she had called a mental health crisis line from the church just after 10 a.m., saying she felt suicidal. Then at 10:55, she stopped using the church internet service, suggesting she was either shot right before then or right after that point. And so in Stumpo's mind, it was easy to imagine a desperate, lonely person making one last call for help before just ending it all. But then, on January 30th, Stumpo received the autopsy report. Sitting at his desk in the police barracks 15 miles from Springfield Township, Stumpo marveled at what he read in the report. It didn't solve the case by any means, but it did make one thing clear. This was no suicide. The medical examiner found that Rhonda had been shot twice. The first bullet glanced off her forehead, while the second round penetrated her skull. What's more, the shots were fired from 3 or 4 feet away, suggesting that the shooter was on the other side of the desk from Rhonda. The coroner said Rhonda's head had none of the tiny burn marks that are associated with shots fired at extremely close range, like a suicide gunshot would be. And so Stumpo concluded that, while Rhonda may have been depressed, she certainly did not pull the trigger to end her own life. She was definitely murdered. About a week later, on the evening of February 6th, Stumpo and another investigator named Bob Egan arrived at Trinity Lutheran Church just before 7 p.m. when choir practice was about to begin. One of the few members of the church community they had not spoken with yet was Mary Jane Fonder, though they had heard a lot about her. Mostly that she was very eccentric, wore her wig backwards sometimes, and periodically dropped off pies for the pastor and for Rhonda. And so Stumpo and the other investigator walked into the church, and right away they spotted Mary Jane along with the other members of the choir getting ready to start their practice, and the investigators flagged Mary Jane and asked her to come with them so they could talk to her in a side room. But as they were walking over to this room, Mary Jane said to them that she had actually been meaning to reach out to them because she had spoken to Rhonda a couple of days before she was killed. Mary Jane said she had called into the church and was surprised when Rhonda answered and not the normal secretary. But Mary Jane said she had actually just taken the time to talk to Rhonda because Mary Jane had been worried about Rhonda's state of mind, like many other people in the church were. And so Mary Jane told the investigators that Rhonda apparently had such a crush on Pastor Shreves that at least to Mary Jane, it seemed like it was clouding her judgment. And the example that Mary Jane gave to show this was she said the minister had organized a birthday party for Rhonda just before her death, and Rhonda had not invited Mary Jane to attend, even though in Mary Jane's eyes, they were close friends. And so it just seemed like Rhonda was being weirdly protective of Pastor Shreves and didn't want other women there. Mary Jane would also tell the investigators that she was just too upset to even attend Rhonda's memorial service, but she had baked a pie for Rhonda's parents and visited with them after the service. Then Detective Egan asked Mary Jane point blank, did she own a gun? And Mary Jane kind of laughed and said no, and she wouldn't even know how to use one. So the detectives thanked Mary Jane for her time, and then she turned and headed back over to choir practice, and the detectives walked out of the church feeling like they were no closer to solving this crime. But having now met Mary Jane, she seemed less like this totally eccentric, weird person that people had made her out to be, and more just like a very harmless old lady. The following day, February 7th, Stumpo learned that the state police were reassigning the other 2 detectives in his unit to other cases that weren't even murders. Stumpo knew what that meant. His bosses were losing confidence in his investigation because he was not making enough progress. And so now the Rhonda murder investigation was down to just him and Detective Egan, who was on loan from headquarters. And as weeks passed by, still with no breakthrough, Stumpo began to worry that they might never solve this crime. But Detective Egan, who was a veteran homicide investigator, kept saying that you never know when a hot tip will come in the door. And that's exactly what happened on a cold and windy morning on Saturday, March 29th, nearly 9 weeks after Rhonda's murder. 6 miles from Trinity Lutheran Church, a man and his 8-year-old son were fishing in Lake Nakamixon under the bridge that runs across it. At some point, the boy noticed something shiny in the muddy, shallow water at the lake's edge. He pulled what looked like a toy gun out of the water and showed off his trophy to his dad. But when the boy's father took a look, he realized his son was not holding a toy, it was a real gun. The father snatched the revolver from the boy's hands and immediately popped open the cylinder and shook the weapon to make sure it was not loaded. 3 live rounds fell into the mud, plus the casing from a bullet which had already been fired. The boy's father called the state police barracks where Stumpo worked to report that his son had found a loaded gun in the lake, and the man wondered what he should do with it. The trooper who answered this phone call, whose name was Andrew Mincer, had been the first police officer on the scene at the Rhonda Smith shooting, and he immediately thought of the missing weapon from that crime. Mincer asked the father for the serial number on the gun, and after he got it, he told the father to hang onto the gun and give it to nobody else until he, Mincer, could get there to pick it up. As soon as Mincer hung up the phone, he ran the serial number through the National Crime Information Center, and in minutes, he learned who the Rossi .38 revolver was registered to. Stumpo was in the police barracks when this call came in, but he was down in the locker room thinking about how little time he had spent with his 5-year-old son lately. Police work was literally taking over Stumpo's life, and he had so little to show for it. Stumpo was about to head home when his cell phone rang. The call was coming from within the station he was standing in, and so Stumpo sighed at the thought of even more police work to do. But the instant Stumpo answered, Mincer, who was very excited, told him that a little boy who had been fishing out in Lake Nakamixon had just found a .38 caliber revolver just like the one that had been fired at Rhonda Smith. Mincer said the gun was purchased in 1994, 14 years before Rhonda's murder. But despite being a bit old and having been in the water, it still appeared to be in working condition. And so Stumpo suddenly felt totally energized, and he couldn't help but think, this sounds like we have just found the murder weapon. The next day was a Sunday, but the ballistics expert at the state trooper barracks happened to be in the crime lab that day, working on another case. Stumpo convinced him to drop what he was doing and test the gun the boy found in the lake against the slug that the coroner pulled from Rhonda. And the test proved the revolver found in the lake was the one that killed Rhonda. The next day, Detective Stumpo and Egan visited the address associated with the original owner of the gun. And the property they went to was this rundown cabin at the end of a long driveway sitting on 11 acres of woods. Stumpo and Egan knew that this address was probably an important break in the case, but it didn't mean the original owner of this gun was definitely Rhonda's killer. It had been 14 years since this revolver was purchased, so plenty of time for the gun to change hands may be off the books. After Stumpo knocked, an old man wearing a dress shirt and a plastic pocket protector opened the door just a crack and peered out very suspiciously at the detectives. Egan asked if it would be okay if they came inside and spoke to him, and the man very reluctantly opened the door the rest of the way and stepped aside to let them come in. Stumpo and Egan were appalled by what they saw inside. The house was a hoarder's den. Junk-filled boxes and papers piled high and covered with cobwebs and bird droppings. The entire place just totally reeked, to the point where both detectives were breathing through their mouths just so they didn't have to smell the air. Now, the police knew this man was not the original owner of the gun. It was actually his sister who lived with him. And so the detectives asked him if his sister was home, but the man said she wasn't. So the detectives asked him if he knew that his sister had at one point purchased a .38 revolver. The man said that his sister had trouble with a coworker several years back and felt kind of threatened, so she had bought a gun. But she only shot it once in the yard for practice, and the noise was apparently too much for her. Her brother said that she had thrown the gun away years ago, and he didn't know where she threw it away, and he had never seen it or heard about it again. But Stumpo and Egan were not fully convinced about this story. They told the brother that the gun had just been pulled out of the lake. If the gun had been tossed into the water in 1994, shortly after his sister bought it, then by now it would be totally covered in rust. But the gun had no rust on it, which indicated it had not been in the lake for more than a few weeks. The brother fell quiet for a moment, and then told the investigators that he did have something to show them. He took them outside to his car, and he lifted the driver's floor mat to reveal something which shocked the two investigators, and it confirmed that they were on the right track. The old man showed the detectives shiny pieces of metal that were underneath the floor mat of his car, and the detectives immediately recognized these fragments as being part of a bullet casing. Now, when that boy had found the gun in the lake, it had contained 3 live rounds and 1 spent shell casing. However, investigators knew that Rhonda had been shot twice, so there needed to be 2 spent shell casings. And so far, all they could account for was that one that the boy found in the gun. And now, these fragments on the floor of the car could be, potentially, pieces of that other spent round. At last, Stumpo finally had his primary suspect. It was this old man's sister, the original owner of this gun. And that afternoon, police were able to arrest her right as she left the Trinity Lutheran Church, driving her brother's car. The same car that police had just found those fragments from the shell casing underneath the floor mat. Also, after they made this arrest, police searched the inside of the car, and they found a calendar with January 23rd circled, the day Rhonda was murdered, and over that date on the calendar were the words, Rhonda murdered. Based on Stumpo and Egan's investigation, here is what really happened on January 23rd, the day Rhonda was murdered. At 10:30 a.m. on January 23rd, the killer slipped into her brother's car and drove to Trinity Lutheran Church. She pulled into the parking lot, and as she did, she looked over at the first-floor office window, and she saw Rhonda sitting inside. The killer got out of the car, walked up to the side door of the church, they unlocked it, and went inside. Once inside, the killer looked around the building and determined that Rhonda was the only person inside. The killer then walked over to the church office where Rhonda was. She went inside, and as soon as she did, Rhonda's face lit up with recognition and a smile, until Rhonda noticed the revolver in the killer's hand. Seconds later, the killer raised the gun, aimed it at Rhonda, and fired. The shot struck Rhonda right in the forehead, knocking her off her chair and onto the floor. The killer rushed around the desk and stood over Rhonda, and right away they noticed the bullet had only grazed Rhonda's forehead. And so with Rhonda writhing in pain on the carpet, the killer backed up a couple of feet and then raised their gun again, aimed it at the side of Rhonda's head, and fired. And this time, the bullet went right into Rhonda's head. Satisfied that Rhonda was now dead, the killer casually left the church and drove to a hair appointment. After the detectives questioned her in connection with the murder, the killer got nervous and decided to get rid of the gun. So the killer borrowed her brother's car, drove 6 miles to that bridge that crossed over Lake Nakamixon, and the killer tossed the gun out the window without even stopping. And then, a month later, the boy and his father would find the gun. It would turn out the original owner of the gun and Rhonda's murderer was none other than the eccentric, backwards wig-wearing, apple pie-making Mary Jane Fonder. Mary Jane did not see Rhonda as a desperately lonely, depressed person on the brink of suicide. Instead, she saw Rhonda as this pretty young thing who was competing with her, Mary Jane, for the affection and love of Pastor Shreves. Mary Jane was convinced that Rhonda and the pastor were having this romantic love affair, even though they totally were not. In Mary Jane's mind, she believed that she and Pastor Shreves had this undeniable chemistry, and they were meant to be together. And she was sure he felt the same way, even though he repeatedly asked her to stop calling him and to basically leave him alone. The last straw for Mary Jane had been when the pastor had raised money to help Rhonda out, and then got the whole congregation to clap and applaud for her when she was up there speaking. No one ever helped out Mary Jane when she lost her job and needed money, and Mary Jane had been a member of the church for 14 years. Compared to her, Rhonda was a newcomer. So Mary Jane killed Rhonda out of spite and jealousy, and with the hope that once Rhonda was out of the way, Mary Jane would have the pastor all to herself. All of this was obviously delusional, but Mary Jane believed it. And it would turn out this wasn't the first time Mary Jane was connected to a suspicious death. Back in 1993, her 83-year-old father disappeared. Mary Jane, who was his caretaker, claimed that he walked out of the house and never came home. Now, at the time, police did suspect that Mary Jane had killed her father and either completely destroyed his body or managed to hide it really well. And Mary Jane, she remained under suspicion for this death, but police could never prove it. In the end, Mary Jane would be convicted of murdering Rhonda, and she would be sentenced to life in prison. However,